On a frozen January morning in 1894, deep in the Ozark hills, a girl named Sarah Whitlock ran barefoot through the trees as if the devil himself clawed at her back. Folks in the nearby town would later swear they heard her screaming long before they saw her. She claimed she had escaped a family, respected by every church-going soul in Stone County. But she also claimed something else, something no one wanted to believe. So here's my question to you. What would make a 14-year-old say, "My brothers weren't men, they were monsters"? If you think you're ready to hear what really happened inside the Whitlock home, prove it. Subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from so you can officially join the investigation. Now, I want you to picture the Ozarks in 1894, not the postcard version, not the tourist fantasy, but the real thing. Endless ridgelines, jagged limestone cliffs, and hollers so deep sunlight barely touched the moss that grew along their floors. Life here moved at the pace of the wind through the cedars, slow, silent, patient. And the people, they were the same. Suspicious of outsiders, loyal to blood, and stubborn in a way only mountain folk can be. You have to understand something about that era. The law barely reached these hills. A sheriff might ride through once a month, maybe twice if there'd been a killing or two, but beyond that, families governed themselves. Reputation was currency. A good name could buy you protection from anything, including the truth. And the Whitlocks? Oh, they had the best name in Stone County. Church-going, land-owning, God-fearing stock. Their patriarch, Elijah Whitlock, was known for preaching about discipline and salvation in that order. His sons, Jonas, Micah, and the youngest, Caleb, were praised for their manners, their work ethic, and their unwavering loyalty to their father's rules. Respectable, steady, untouched by scandal. But if you've listened to this channel long enough, you already know what that means. The families who look the most perfect from the outside usually have the darkest rot beneath the floorboards. And trust me, by the time Sarah told her story, people in Stone County would wonder how they ever looked those boys in the eyes without feeling the chill of something inhuman staring back. So let me ask, does a place shape a monster, or does a monster choose its home? Let's talk about the brothers Jonas, Micah, and Caleb Whitlock. On paper, they were the kind of sons any Ozark family would have bragged about. Jonas, the eldest, carried himself like a man twice his age, quiet, disciplined, and always watching. The kind of boy who could split a log clean in half with one swing and never break a sweat. Folks called him steady-handed. Sarah would later say he had the calm of a hunter right before the kill. Micah, the middle brother, had charm, a smile that could smooth over any unease, a laugh that carried across the churchyard, a gentleness that made people mistake him for harmless. But Sarah said his smile never once reached his eyes, and if you looked closely, really closely, you'd see the flicker of something cold just beneath the surface, like a man rehearsing kindness instead of feeling it. Then there was Caleb, the baby of the family, only 13, just a year younger than Sarah, but the townspeople swore he had a temper that flared without warning. Animals bolted when he walked by. Children avoided him without ever knowing why. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice had that flat, emotionless tone that makes your gut tighten before your mind can explain it. To the county, the Whitlock brothers were good boys, hard workers, devout Christians, the pride of Elijah Whitlock. But Sarah would later confess something that still chills. They didn't learn cruelty, she said. They enjoyed it. Now tell me how many monsters hide behind polite smiles. Here's where things get interesting. Every great villain has a believable mask, and the Whitlocks had one crafted so perfectly it fooled an entire county. Their home, a white-painted, two-story structure perched on a ridge, looked like something out of a moral instruction book. Quilts on the line, smoke curling from the chimney, psalms drifting out every Sunday morning as Elijah led family worship. They were known for generosity too. Elijah donated lumber for the schoolhouse. His sons repaired fences for widows and helped haul supplies across washed-out roads. Caleb even tended the church garden during summer months. You see what I mean? A picture-perfect facade. People trusted them so deeply that when children went missing in the hills, the Whitlocks were the first to help search. When livestock turned up slaughtered in strange patterns, they were the ones who reassured frightened families that wolves had returned to the ridge. And whenever someone whispered a concern, just a quiet, passing doubt, Micah was always there with that carefully practiced smile, ready to soothe it away. Their secret? They never lied outright. They simply steered people toward explanations that felt safe. Wolves, strangers passing through, accidents. In a place where superstition ran wild, Elijah knew the trick. Give people a rational lie wrapped in a comforting tone. They'll take it every time. Sarah later said, "It wasn't what they told people that scared me. It was how easily people believed them." So ask yourself how much horror can hide behind a reputation polished bright enough to blind a town. Now, this is the part I need you to picture in detail, because the Whitlock's darkness didn't grow in silence. It thrived in a hidden system, one so carefully arranged that even the most suspicious mountain folk never questioned it. Behind their house was a root cellar dug deep into the hillside. Everyone in the Ozarks had one used, for storing potatoes and curing meat. Nothing unusual. But the Whitlock cellar had a second entrance, a narrow, hand-cut tunnel hidden behind stacked timber, leading to a chamber carved into the stone itself. No windows. No air except what seeped through cracks in the limestone. Sarah called it the place where sound died. This chamber wasn't empty. Wooden restraints, iron hooks, a dirt floor hardened by years of misuse, and carved into the walls scratches, some shallow, some gouged deep, marks left by hands desperate to escape. But here's where it gets worse. Elijah had created a system around it. He kept strict routines, strict alibis, strict public appearances. The boys followed his rules with military precision. No screaming victim ever made it outside. No trace was ever left behind except bones crushed into the soil or remains scattered in the ravine. People said the Whitlocks were organized, disciplined, structured. They had no idea how terrifying that was. And every time a child vanished, every time a traveler never made it to the next town, the Whitlocks had the same calm, practiced response. Mountain lions roam these hills. It happens. Tell me, how do you stop evil that hides inside perfect order? Now, I want you to really picture this. By the time the strange incidents began piling up around the Whitlock property, the townspeople already had their explanations prepared for them because Elijah made sure of it. And honestly, his excuses were so ordinary, so painfully reasonable, that no one ever bothered to look deeper. That's how real horrors survive, wrapped in explanations that feel comforting enough to believe. When neighbors heard muffled cries drifting across the ridge at night, Elijah would shake his head and say, "Coyotes again. They get bold this time of year." And of course people nodded, because coyotes were common. When someone noticed dark stains along the back trail, Jonas calmly explained they'd butchered a hog that morning. Perfectly normal on a farm. Perfectly innocent. Then there were the disappearances. A trapper who never returned to camp. A farmhand who simply moved on. A pair of siblings who wandered too far into the woods and likely drowned in the creek. And every time, Elijah stood beside the sheriff with that solemn, prayerful expression that made him look like the county's moral anchor. He'd lay a hand on a grieving mother's shoulder and murmur, "The mountains take who they choose." Even the church defended him. Pastor Whelan once said, "If Elijah says it, that's truth enough for me." And just like that, every oddity, every sign of something deeply wrong was smoothed over with a calm voice and a script people already trusted. Sarah later whispered, "It wasn't that they didn't see the signs, it was that they didn't want to." So tell me, what's more dangerous, a monster in the dark, or the excuse that keeps you from seeing it? Now this is the part people never expect. Every monstrous family has one outsider who helps keep the whole machine running. Someone who isn't blood, but might as well be. Someone who knows just enough to be dangerous, yet not enough to stop what's happening, because stopping it would mean confronting their own cowardice. For the Whitlocks, that collaborator was Sheriff Abram Cole. The county trusted him the same way a frightened child trusts a locked door. Big man, thick mustache, Bible always tucked in his coat pocket. Folks said he was the kind of lawman who could stare down a bear. But Sarah would later insist that Abram never stared down anything that looked like the Whitlock brothers. See, Abram grew up with Elijah. They hunted together as boys. They shared secrets, swore oaths. In these mountains, that kind of history binds tighter than rope. And when Elijah rose to power, quiet, moral, respectable Abram followed, not out of loyalty to justice, but loyalty to the man he believed would shape the county's future. Whenever someone reported a missing person, Abram would take the complaint, then gently talk the family out of filing a formal report. People wander, he'd say. Storms come through. Folks lose their way. Best not jump to conclusions. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't fooled. But he also wasn't brave, because to question Elijah meant questioning the entire foundation of who he himself had become. And that's the thing about collaborators. They don't have to commit the crimes. They just have to help bury them. So ask yourself how much evil thrives because one man chooses silence over courage. Now, I want you to slow down and picture the people who found themselves caught in the Whitlock's path because they weren't random and they weren't chosen by chance. Predators, like Elijah and his sons, never hunt blindly. They pick victims who fit a pattern, a vulnerability, a silence they can exploit. And in the Ozarks of 1894, those vulnerabilities were everywhere. There were the travelers, men passing through the mountains on their way to mining camps or riverboats. Nobody knew their names. Nobody expected them home. When they vanished, the world didn't shake, it barely noticed. Then there were the orphans drifting between homesteads, taken in for labor more than love. Kids already accustomed to hunger, hard work, and keeping their mouths shut. Easy prey. But the Whitlocks had a second category, one far darker. The forgotten locals, sickly children, young women with no family left, men whose drinking made them unreliable witnesses, people the town pitied but never protected, folks who lived on the edge of the ridge, where a scream could disappear into the wind without anyone turning their head. Sarah later said the victims shared one unmistakable trait. They were people no one would come looking for. Not fast enough, anyway. And that's the cruel brilliance of it. The Whitlocks didn't hunt the strong, they hunted the invisible. Some victims fought. Some wept. Some begged. The scratches carved into the cellar walls still told their stories better than any sheriff's report ever would. So let me ask you, how many tragedies go unrecorded simply because the world decides certain people are easier to forget? This is where everything shifts. Because monsters like the Whitlocks survive only as long as no one sees them clearly. And the person who finally did, the one who stumbled onto their secret purely by chance, was a farmhand named Elias Turner, a 19-year-old boy with more heart than sense and a habit of wandering places he shouldn't. Now, I want you to picture him. Lanky, dirt-smudged, carrying a bundle of firewood on his shoulder as he cut across the ridge to save time. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't even looking for the Whitlocks. He was just trying to beat the storm rolling in from the south. As he passed near the Whitlock property, he heard something faint at first, like a muffled thumping beneath the ground. At first, he figured it was an animal trapped in an old hunter's pit, but then came the sound that froze him in place. A voice, a human voice. Young, panicked, whispering, "Please, please don't leave me." Elias dropped the wood, moved closer. He pressed his ear to the earth near the back of the Whitlock house and realized the sound wasn't coming from the woods, it was coming from underground. And when he followed the noise to a half-concealed vent pipe running out of the hillside, he heard the pleading again, a cry so soft it barely rode the wind. Before he could process what he was hearing, the cellar door slammed open. Jonas Whitlock stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth that looked far too dark to be dirt. He stared into the woods with those hunter's eyes. Of his, the one Sarah said could see the shape of a lie from a mile away. Elias held his breath, didn't move, didn't blink, and for a moment he thought he was safe. But then Jonas tilted his head, almost like he sensed the shape of someone hiding in the trees. Elias didn't wait. He bolted, crashing through branches and tearing through brush, as Jonas shouted something sharp and furious behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached the Turner homestead, chest heaving, face white as bone. But when he tried to tell the adults what he'd heard, nobody listened. Nobody wanted to. because accusing the Whitlocks meant upending the one family the county depended on. And that's the curse of an accidental witness. They see the truth, but no one sees them. Now, let's slow down and really feel what happens after someone like Elias sees the truth, because surviving the sight of monsters doesn't make you safe. In fact, it often makes you the first target of a second, more insidious danger: disbelief. Elias Turner returned home that night, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He tried to tell his parents what he'd seen, what he'd heard, the cries from that hidden chamber, the cold precision of the Whitlock brothers' cruelty. But his father, worn from the long day in the fields, shook his head and muttered, "You're imagining things, son. Don't let the wind and shadows fool you." His mother, pale and weary, said the same, adding, "Some stories are better, left alone. Imagine that running through the woods, seeing a human trapped in darkness, and being told your eyes are lying." Elias felt his stomach twist, his confidence drain, and the weight of fear settle into his bones. Sleep became a stranger. Every shadow in the cabin, every creak of the floorboards above made him flinch. His own breathing sounded suspicious. Every visitor knocking on the door made him think, "Did the Whitlocks know I saw too much?" He tried to reach the sheriff, a trusted figure, only to hear polite dismissal. "Mountain folk get strange ideas," the sheriff said. "Best to keep them to yourself." And so the young man carried the memory alone, carrying guilt, terror, and the heavy knowledge that truth can be a prison as confining as any cellar. Sarah, years later, told me something that chilled me. He was a witness, but the world wouldn't let him be human. Again, they treated him like a liar because the monster wore a suit of respectability. And here's the question I want you to consider. What is more terrifying, the sight of a monster, or the sight of a world so eager to deny it that it punishes the one who tells the truth? Because for Elias, the Whitlocks hadn't even needed to strike him. Society had done it for them, crushing him with disbelief, fear, and the unbearable silence of people who didn't want to see. And that, my friends, is a lesson about horror most never truly understand. Now, here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because monsters like the Whitlocks aren't only hidden behind locked doors, they're shielded by the very system that's supposed to stop them. And when the first rumors of their crimes reached the county authorities, what unfolded was a masterclass in plausible deniability. The Sheriff Abram Cole convened a formal inquiry, at least in name. Notices were sent, a handful of townspeople were questioned, and Elias Turner, trembling, recounted every horrifying detail he could remember. But the room was stacked against truth. The Whitlocks attended, polished and polite, their calm demeanor radiating innocence. Each brother smiled as though he were attending a church service, answering questions with rehearsed sincerity. Jonas, ever precise, offered a detailed account of the cellar's maintenance, what Elias had overheard as cries, the echoes of animals. Trapped during a routine inspection, he claimed. Micah, the charming middle son, smiled and explained the scratches on the walls as results of old wood shifting under moisture. Caleb, quiet but observant, simply nodded, eyes piercing yet unreadable, giving the illusion of sincerity. The officials nodded, scribbling notes, never questioning the brothers' alibis too deeply. And when Elias tried to press, to insist that he had seen a trapped human being, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and murmured, "Son, mountain folk see shadows where there are none. You might have imagined it." The truth. No one wanted to acknowledge it. Admitting the Whitlocks' crimes meant shattering the county's trust in families, in the church, in law itself. The inquiry wasn't a search for justice, it was a performance, a public display of due diligence that left the monsters untouched. Sarah later confided, "They made it impossible to be believed. The world had a choice, see the horror or keep the illusion alive. They chose illusion. And here's what I want you to think about. How often do systems protect the guilty, not because they are corrupted, but because admitting the truth is too inconvenient? For Elias, the inquiry didn't save anyone. It only cemented a truth more painful than the sight itself. Some monsters thrive not just in darkness, but behind a veil of official denial. Now, I want you to picture the victims, not those who had vanished, but the ones who survived. Because surviving the Whitlocks didn't mean life returned to normal. It meant carrying scars, both visible and invisible, that screamed louder than any testimony. These were altered humans, walking proof of horrors too grotesque for polite society to acknowledge. Sarah, for instance, had spent months confined to the cellar, her small frame bruised and pale, her hair matted and coarse from neglect. She didn't just leave with scratches. She carried the constant trembling of fear embedded in her bones. Her eyes, once bright and curious, had learned a cautiousness that made strangers seem like predators. And when she spoke, even quietly, her voice bore the memory of screams that had echoed in stone walls for nights on end. Others were just as changed. Some victims developed a nervous tic, a hand twitch, a flinch at the faintest sound. Some refused to eat in front of others, haunted by hunger-induced trauma. One boy wouldn't sleep in a bed without feeling for hidden tunnels beneath the floorboards. Their bodies had survived, yes, but their souls bore the evidence of cruelty meticulously orchestrated over months, perhaps years. Even the community noticed it. Teachers remarked on children who suddenly shrank into corners, avoiding eye contact. Neighbors whispered about adults who never laughed, who flinched at shadows or locked doors obsessively. And yet, no one questioned the Whitlocks openly. The survivors became living contradictions, proof of crimes people preferred to ignore. A daily reminder of horror hidden behind polished facades. Sarah would later say something chilling. We weren't broken, we were changed. And that made everyone uncomfortable. So ask yourself this: how much of a person can you alter before the world sees them only as evidence rather than a human being? Because the Whitlocks didn't just create victims, they engineered living warnings. And these warnings would speak the truth long after whispers in the courthouse and letters to the sheriff had faded into convenient silence. And here's the question I want to leave with you. When the evidence is alive, staring back at the world, how easily can society still look away? Now, I need you to picture this. The Whitlocks weren't chaotic in their cruelty. They weren't driven solely by impulse or malice. No, there was a method, a chilling, calculated system that turned terror into almost a craft. And understanding it is what separates horror from madness. Elijah Whitlock, the patriarch, approached the dark arts of his household with precision. Every rule, every routine, every interaction was designed to maximize fear while minimizing suspicion. The cellar wasn't just a hiding place, it was a laboratory of control. He studied reactions, timed screams, measured responses. Notes scratched in journals hidden beneath floorboards recorded who resisted, who broke first, and who could be bent with whispers alone. The brothers followed a regimen as precise as clockwork. Jonas, the eldest, monitored the temperature and light levels in the cellar to ensure the victims never acclimated. Sleep became a nightmare, the body perpetually tense. Micah practiced psychological manipulation. Whispers at night, promises of release that never came, rotating who saw which horrors to create uncertainty. Caleb, surprisingly meticulous for his age, documented every failure, every small defiance, and reported it to his father. The Whitlocks' methodology wasn't random brutality, it was science applied to terror. They observed, tested, and adapted, ensuring that fear became instinct. Victims learned to obey before commands were even spoken. Resistance was anticipated, catalogued, and punished, often in ways designed to leave minimal physical trace but maximum psychological effect. Even outside the cellar, Elijah maintained control. He manipulated neighbors, staged accidental events, and ensured his sons never left evidence of their experiments. And when the inevitable outsider like Elias Turner came too close, the family's methods ensured he would see enough to fear, but not enough to immediately convict. Sarah later whispered, "It wasn't cruelty that made them terrifying, it was intelligence. Every detail considered, every scream measured, every shadow planned." And here's what I want you to consider. How do you fight monsters who have treated evil like a science? Because in this house, horror wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. It was deliberate. And that, my friends, is what makes it truly unforgettable. Now, I want you to picture someone stepping into a story that already feels impossible to survive. Someone flawed, determined, and unwilling to look away. That person is Sarah Whitlock, the girl who would become more than a witness. She was 14, small in stature, yet her mind had already sharpened like a blade from months of terror. Her body carried bruises and scratches, but her spirit, well, that was something the Whitlocks hadn't accounted for. Sarah wasn't born heroic, far from it. She was curious, intelligent, and stubborn in ways that had often gotten her into trouble before. But the cellar, the hidden chambers, the chilling rituals she had survived, they forged something inside her that was stronger than fear. She had learned to observe without being seen, to memorize routines, to anticipate movements, and now, she realized, knowledge could become power. I want you to picture her first night after escaping, sleeping in the cold woods, shivering, yet refusing to close her eyes completely. Every snap of a twig made her flinch, every distant howl reminded her of what awaited if she misstepped. But alongside the terror, there was a spark, the knowledge that the world had no idea what the Whitlocks had done, and that someone had to reveal it. And this is where her personal stakes became clear. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was justice, or at least, a reckoning of some kind. Every secret she had observed, every whispered cruelty, every horrifying detail was now ammunition. Her youth and small size belied her intellect, her determination, and her courage. She would infiltrate, expose, and endure. But here's the thing I want you to consider. Heroes aren't born perfect. They are shaped by the horrors they survive, the mistakes they make, and the moments where fear almost wins. Sarah was flawed, reckless at times, and painfully human, but that made her relatable and ultimately more capable than anyone expected. So I ask you this. Can a 14-year-old girl truly outwit a family built on decades of calculated cruelty? Can someone so young and fragile face monsters who treat terror like science and survive? Because Sarah Whitlock was about to prove, against all odds, that even the darkest shadows can't smother the fire of one determined soul. Now, let's get inside Sarah's mind, because this is where the story becomes not just terrifying, but intensely human. Escaping the Whitlocks was only the beginning. Surviving the hills and the night wasn't enough. She needed proof, something undeniable that could expose the truth, and to do that, she had to step back into the monster's lair, figuratively, if not literally. Sarah began watching from the shadows. She memorized the Whitlocks' daily routines, noting when Jonas patrolled the woods, when Micah entertained neighbors with that polished charm, and when Caleb vanished into the cellar tunnel. She catalogued everything, the creak of the trapdoor, the flicker of the lantern in the hidden passage, the faint smell of iron and damp stone. Every detail became a weapon, every observation a shield. She also tested them carefully, leaving small objects in specific places to see if anyone noticed, listening for patterns in their speech, in the rhythm of their movements, even in the cadence of their laughter. Sarah learned to anticipate punishment and distraction alike. Every interaction was a calculated risk, but the more she studied them, the more she realized the Whitlock system, for all its intelligence, had a blind spot, her understanding of human behavior. And this is where her personal stakes became razor-sharp. The more she observed, the clearer the danger, but also the clearer the opportunity. She could exploit their overconfidence, their reliance on predictability. Every step was measured, every whisper of the cellar, every ritualized cruelty became data. Sarah had transformed fear into strategy. Her courage was not reckless, it was informed. Every heartbeat of terror reminded her, if she failed, there would be no one left to tell the story. Now, I want you to picture this. A 14-year-old girl moving like a ghost through her former prison, cataloging horrors, learning secrets, and outwitting three monsters who thought they had mastered every human weakness. It's terrifying, and yet, it's also where heroism is born. So here's my question to you. How does someone so young navigate the intelligence of cruelty without breaking? And how far can courage stretch when the world has already decided it won't believe you? Because Sarah Whitlock wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing to fight not with weapons, but with truth, observation, and relentless cunning. Now, I need you to pause for a moment and really consider what we've uncovered so far. Sarah Whitlock has escaped, witnessed horrors most of us couldn't imagine, and begun a meticulous investigation into a family that treats terror like science. She's 14, terrified, and yet unbelievably determined. And here's where I have to ask you, can you handle what comes next? Because the story is about to dive even deeper into the dark heart of the Whitlocks. You're not just a bystander anymore. You're part of this investigation. I want you to picture every creaking floorboard, every whispered secret, every shadow moving just out of reach. That's what Sarah navigates every day, and you're right there with her. If you're brave enough to follow, make sure to subscribe now, hit that bell, comment below where you're watching from, and officially join the investigation. This is where the story turns truly chilling, and I promise you, you don't want to miss a single terrifying, detailed moment of what comes next. Because the Whitlock's secrets are about to be fully exposed, and the question remains, will Sarah and you survive to see it? Now, let me take you right into the moment that changed everything. Sarah had been watching, memorizing, and learning, but until now, she had no concrete proof, nothing to confront the Whitlocks with, nothing to convince a skeptical world. That all changed one evening as she followed Caleb into the woods under the pretense of fetching firewood. She noticed the boy hesitate near the base of the ridge, glancing back over his shoulder. Her curiosity piqued. She crept closer, staying low in the brush. That's when she saw it. A hidden panel in the hillside, partially concealed by moss and fallen leaves. Caleb stepped aside for Jonas to enter, lantern in hand, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She waited, breath shallow, then slipped forward to inspect the entrance once the brothers disappeared inside. Inside the chamber, Sarah found the damning evidence. Wooden restraints still embedded in the stone floor, rusted iron hooks protruding from the walls, and most horrifyingly, personal effects of the victim's tiny shoes, scraps of clothing, and a tattered diary belonging to one of the local children who had vanished months before. Each item told a story that no one in town had ever wanted to hear. The room smelled of damp earth and something metallic, almost like blood. It was a silent testimony of cruelty meticulously hidden from the world. And in that moment, Sarah understood. She held proof powerful enough to expose the Whitlocks, but only if she could survive long enough to bring it to light. Now, I want you to picture this. Evidence in your hands that the world refuses to believe exists. How do you make them see what they don't want to see? That's the challenge Sarah now faced, and the tension that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, imagine the air thick with tension. Every step, Sarah takes a gamble between life and death. She clutched the stolen evidence, pieces of a horror no one in Stone County could yet comprehend, and crept back through the shadows, careful to avoid the Whitlocks' watchful eyes. Her heart hammered so violently it felt like the forest itself would hear. But as she reached the tree line, a branch snapped underfoot. Jonas appeared, towering and silent, eyes narrowing as he realized she had been in the chamber. The chase began. She bolted, legs burning, leaping over roots and rocks, weaving through the twisted Ozark underbrush. Behind her, the heavy footfalls of Jonas, Micah, and Caleb echoed relentless, mechanical, terrifying. Sarah ducked under low-hanging branches, slid down embankments, and used every trick she had learned in the weeks of observing the Whitlocks. At one point, she dove into the icy creek, letting the water mask her scent and slow her pursuers. She dared a glance back. Jonas's lantern bobbed on the ridge, a glowing eye tracking her every move. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, she reached a ridge, overlooking the Turner homestead. Exhausted, bleeding from minor scrapes, and shaking violently, she realized she had survived, but barely. The Whitlocks were still out there, silhouettes against the moonlight, furious and calculating, knowing their secrets had been touched, and their control threatened. And here's the question I want you to hold on to. How do you fight monsters who are faster, stronger, and prepared for every escape? Sarah had outwitted them this time, but the Whitlocks were patient, intelligent, and ruthless. And the story was far from over. Do you feel that chill down your spine? That's the terror of being hunted by something you thought you understood, only to realize the real danger is just beginning. Now, picture Sarah, bruised, soaked, and trembling, finally reaching the outskirts of civilization. The Turner homestead came into view, a warm, flickering light promising safety. For the first time since her escape, she allowed herself a trembling breath, thinking the worst might finally be behind her. But the Whitlocks' influence ran deeper than anyone realized, and the world she returned to was not prepared to face the truth. She ran to the house, pounding on the door. Her parents, shocked by her appearance and desperation, listened as she recounted every detail: the cellar, the hidden chambers, the evidence she had collected. But instead of relief or action, she met skepticism. "Sarah," her father said cautiously, "you've been through a lot. Maybe you imagined some of it." Her mother avoided her gaze, hands wringing. Outside, the wind carried distant echoes, almost as if mocking her plight. Sarah realized something chilling. The world wanted her silence. Authority figures, neighbors, even lawmen were unwilling or afraid to confront the Whitlocks. Civilization, which she had thought a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. And yet, in that reversal, Sarah's resolve hardened. Being disbelieved, being dismissed, was not defeat. It was a call to action. She could not rely on the county, the church, or anyone else to stop the monsters. The only path forward was to wield the proof herself, to ensure that the Whitlocks' carefully hidden crimes could no longer remain buried in the shadows. So I ask you, how do you fight when every person you turn to refuses to see? How do you survive when the world itself conspires with your oppressors? For Sarah, the journey had just begun, and every step forward would bring her closer to exposing the full horror that had haunted the Ozarks for so long. Now, I want you to picture the scene as it unfolded. Lawmen and townspeople, reluctantly convinced by Sarah's evidence, approaching the Whitlock homestead at dawn. The mist hung low in the Ozark hollers, curling around the house like ghostly fingers. The air smelled of frost, damp earth, and something Sarah had smelled too many times before: fear that had been held too long in stone walls. When the sheriff finally forced the cellar door open, the first thing that hit them was the stench of decay. Wooden restraints, now splintered and moldy, were scattered across the dirt floor. Rusted iron hooks protruded like the claws of some mechanical predator. And then came the evidence that silenced the room. Remnants of clothing, hair, and personal belongings of the missing silent witnesses to horrors that had gone unseen for months. Sarah stood back, watching the men recoil, heart rate visible in their pale faces. She noticed some shook their heads, unwilling to process the magnitude of what lay before them. Jonas, Micah, and Caleb Whitlock had tried to hide their crimes behind routine, charm, and fear. But here, every detail of their cruelty was exposed. And then, deeper in the chamber, the townspeople found scratched messages and tally marks, a chilling record of each victim. Every mark told a story of suffering, fear, and control. A ledger of terror meticulously maintained. I want you to imagine the weight of that moment. The truth, long denied, finally undeniable. Every lie the Whitlocks had spun was shredded. Every alibi crumbled. So tell me, how does a family survive when the shadows they relied on are torn away, leaving nothing but the raw, unfiltered horror for all to see? For the first time, the Ozarks confronted the monsters it had unknowingly nurtured, and nothing would ever be the same again. Now, I want you to picture the faces behind. The terror, once polished and respectable, now laid bare for everyone to see. The Whitlocks, Jonas, Micah, Caleb, and even Elijah himself stood exposed, their carefully constructed masks shattered. No longer were they the pious, church-going family, admired across Stone County. They were monsters, ordinary men who had weaponized discipline, intelligence, and charm into tools of horror. Jonas, the eldest, once praised for his steadiness, revealed the hunter's cold precision Sarah had feared. Every careful movement in the cellar, every manipulation of victims, had been his doing. Micah's Charm, which had lulled neighbors into false trust, now appeared sinister, a deliberate tool to disarm and deceive. And Caleb, though the youngest, carried a chilling calculation that belied his age. He had catalogued each victim's reactions with meticulous attention, almost enjoying their terror in ways that sent shivers through everyone watching. And then there was Elijah, the patriarch. His sermons, donations, and public morality had been the perfect camouflage. But standing under the harsh morning light, stripped of the facade, his arrogance was exposed as the root of the family's cruelty. Every rule, every punishment, every hidden chamber had originated with him. For the townspeople, the revelation was staggering. The family they had admired, helped, and trusted had committed horrors beyond imagination, hidden behind smiles and polite gestures. The unmasking was not just of individuals. It was the unmasking of a system of manipulation, secrecy, and terror that had thrived under the guise of normalcy. And here's the chilling thought. How often do monsters walk among us, dressed in respectability, their darkest truths hidden behind manners, appearances, and careful calculation? For Sarah, and for the county, this was the moment the Whitlocks' true nature could no longer be denied. Now I ask you, can you see the monster in plain sight and recognize it before it's too late? Now, I want you to grasp the terrifying scale of what the Whitlocks had orchestrated. What began as a horrifying local operation was not contained to the hills of the Ozarks. Evidence uncovered in the chamber revealed letters, coded journals, and trade receipts, proof of connections far beyond Stone County. The Whitlocks were part of a network that spanned states, even countries, moving people, information, and influence like a shadowy economy of cruelty. Sarah had stumbled onto details that suggested the family traded secrets, leveraged favors, and even bribed distant officials to keep their operations hidden. Certain victims weren't chosen at random. They were moved strategically to other properties, sometimes across state lines. The Whitlocks' reach was precise, intentional, and terrifyingly organized. This was not just a family of monsters, it was an entire system of corruption and exploitation built over decades. The letters spoke of collaborators, contacts who remained invisible to local authorities. Some offered resources, others provided silence. Entire towns, unknowingly, had become pawns in a much larger, sinister game. The Whitlocks' crimes were no longer confined to the cellar or the ridges. They were threads in a web that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. And here's what I want you to consider. How easily can evil spread when it's systematic, strategic, and hidden behind respectability? How many horrors remain undiscovered because they operate in shadows that stretch across borders, protected by complicity and fear? For Sarah, the revelation was almost too much to bear. She had survived the cellar, outwitted the brothers, and now faced the true scale of the nightmare she had uncovered. The Whitlocks weren't just monsters, they were the architects of a sprawling, almost industrialized system of cruelty. Can you feel the weight of that? Because the horror doesn't stop at your backyard, it can reach far beyond, touching lives you'll never even hear about. Now, let's talk about something even more disturbing than the crimes themselves, the way society actively protected the Whitlocks. Because horror doesn't survive only in shadows, it thrives in silence, in the deliberate refusal to look, to question, to act. The county, the church, even distant authorities all played a part, consciously or unconsciously, in keeping the monsters unchallenged. Neighbors, who suspected something odd, stayed quiet, afraid of retaliation or social ostracism. Officials who should have investigated found ways to dismiss complaints. And the church, long a pillar of morality, praised Elijah's piety while ignoring whispers that contradicted the public image. Fear and respect became two sides of the table. Same coin, and the Whitlocks knew exactly how to exploit both. Sarah realized that this conspiracy of silence wasn't a single act, it was woven into the fabric of the community. Every shrugged shoulder, every whispered, "It's none of our business," every polite dismissal of her claims gave the Whitlocks more power. They didn't have to strike everyone directly. Society did part of their work for them. And here's the chilling part. Some of this complicity wasn't born of fear alone. People wanted to believe the world was orderly, that evil only happened elsewhere. Acknowledging the truth, would have meant confronting the darkness in their own backyards, and most weren't willing to do that. So ask yourself this: how often does society turn a blind eye because facing reality is uncomfortable? How many horrors persist, not because of the strength of monsters, but because the world chooses silence over action? For Sarah, this realization made her fight even more personal. She wasn't just up against the Whitlocks anymore. She was fighting the complacency of an entire community that had, in effect, enabled the monsters to thrive. Now, let's fast forward and see what became of the people at the center of this nightmare. The Whitlocks, once untouchable, cloaked in respectability, finally faced consequences, though not always the ones the world expected. Elijah, the patriarch, was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse and neglect, but his cunning ensured he manipulated the system long enough to avoid full exposure for every crime. He spent his final years under house arrest, stripped of his influence, but still bitterly clinging to a semblance of control. Jonas, the eldest, was sentenced to decades in prison, a relentless intellect trapped within stone walls. Even behind bars, he maintained a quiet, unnerving presence, calculating, observant, and as cold as ever. Micah, the charming manipulator, faced a similar fate, though his ability to charm did little to save him from public outrage. Caleb, the youngest, was tried as an accomplice, and, though the courts considered his youth, the meticulous records he had kept ensured he could not escape accountability. Elias Turner, the accidental witness, survived his ordeal but was forever changed, haunted by memory, yet vindicated by the justice he helped spark. And Sarah Whitlock, the hero, who dared to see and speak the truth, emerged both scarred and celebrated. She became a symbol of courage, a reminder that even in a world complicit with monsters, one voice could ignite action. But here's the unsettling reality. While the key players faced justice, the shadow of their crimes lingered. Communities had been corrupted, lives had been altered irreparably, and the systemic failures that allowed evil to thrive could still exist elsewhere. Now, let's step back and consider the shadow the Whitlocks left over the Ozarks, and over every person who survived or witnessed their crimes. Their legacy was not just in the fear they instilled, or the bodies and minds they shattered. It was the lesson they forced the community to confront: that evil can hide behind respectability, that silence can be more dangerous than action, and that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. For Sarah Whitlock, the legacy was deeply personal. She carried scars that would never fully fade, memories that haunted every quiet night. But she also carried knowledge and proof that empowered her and others to speak out, to challenge authority when it failed, and to refuse to look away from injustice. Her courage became a beacon, a moral compass for those who had been silent too long. The community, meanwhile, had to reckon with its complicity. They learned that ignoring horrors does not make them disappear. It allows them to grow, metastasize, until someone like Sarah forces the truth into the light. And in the broader picture, the Whitlocks' crimes became a cautionary tale. Monsters are real, but society's willingness to ignore them can be just as monstrous. So here's the moral I want you to consider. Vigilance, empathy, and courage are as crucial as laws and authority. Evil thrives when ordinary people refuse to see it, and it falters only when someone dares to act. And I leave you with this question. If you were in Sarah's shoes, could you summon the courage to confront what everyone else chooses to ignore? Because sometimes, the survival of truth depends on just one voice brave enough to speak it. Now, take a moment and let it all sink in. Sarah survived. The Whitlocks were unmasked. But the horror lingers not just in the Ozarks, but in the silence that allowed it to thrive. What do you think of this story? Could such horrors remain hidden for so long? How many monsters walk among us, wearing respectability like a mask? Do you believe similar crimes could occur today, unnoticed, unchallenged? I want you to really picture it. The shadows of complicity, the corridors of fear, the quiet witnesses who carry truths no one else dares to acknowledge. Feels unsettling, doesn't it? That's the point. Now, here's where you step in. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share your reflections, your fears, your questions. Subscribe, hit that bell, and join the investigation. Be part of the audience that refuses to look away, the group that demands truth, no matter how dark. And remember, this is only one story in the shadows. There are countless more, waiting to be uncovered. Secrets buried in history, concealed in plain sight, chilling in their audacity.